Hello, welcome to the Korea Society and welcome to Studio Korea. It's a pleasure to have you here this afternoon, and we welcome all of those who are joining us online, either streaming live or in video and audio podcast. Today, we're very pleased to welcome a very keen, profound analyst on the Korean Peninsula, nationally renowned, I'd hasten to add internationally renowned, and that is Robert Carlin. And the wonderful thing about Bob, other than his very keen analytical skills and good humor, is he is a very gifted writer. And as a result, the eminent journalist Don Oberdorfer, the author of The Two Koreas, approached Bob to help write the update of this very, very important work. I would just say by way of introduction that as a professor at university in both Asia and the United States, I employed Don Oberdorfer's great The Two Koreas in some 18 classes. And at the end of courses, of course, professors are evaluated, but the readings are evaluated. There is no book that ranked higher, and I just mentioned this to Bob, number one in every course I taught than The Two Koreas. It really is considered the foremost work in terms of a contemporary history of the Korean Peninsula. And so Bob's role in terms of updating that for us and bringing this forward to a new generation of readers, be they students, business people, or others interested in Korea, cannot be overestimated. So thank you very much, Bob, for what you've done here.
Good.
And I will begin with a question really about the architecture of it. How did you engage this work? It's a profound work. And how did you dissect, divide, recreate, or expand in ways that work?
Well, let me thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you.
Don Oberdorfer's book is a fabulous book. The first editions of it, the first two editions of it, are wonderfully written. And when he asked me to work with him in updating it, I was flabbergasted and honored, and I figured it would be my swan song. I've been working on this a long time, and I thought you couldn't get any better than to be invited to do this. He has a wonderful writing style and a cadence in what he does. And he has there's a sense of personal involvement in it because Don was a journalist of great experience, and so he actually participated in or interviewed many of the key figures over the history of this book in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And so actually one of the first things we had to worry with, and I noticed as I was reading it, is the pronoun I. Don uses it a lot, not to burnish his own credentials, but because he was actually involved. And it gives the book an immediacy, it gives history and immediacy to it, which is really wonderful. So the question was, well, now suddenly another I comes into the book. That's me. And it would be too confusing to the readers. So after discussions with my editor, I think is here, I can't see him, and Don and his wife, we decided, let's keep the I as a reference to Don. And where I enter the book, I'm third person, which is fine. In other words, and if you look at a copy of the book, it's Don Oberdorfer in big type and me in smaller type, and that's exactly how it should be. And that's how I wanted to keep it. I had to cut, because of the exigencies of publishing and things, I had to cut at least 50 pages from the book, because I was not allowed to add more than 10%. It's already 430 pages, so I had to cut 50 pages. That's not easy to do. Don Oberdorfer's work is like a tapestry. So you're not just cutting pages, you're pulling threads out of this tapestry. And you have to make sure you don't pull the wrong threads or you don't interrupt the picture. And then I had to add new things. I had to weave in new information that has come up over the last few years. New archives have opened up. We've got new insights. And so I needed to go back and put the new information in the earlier chapters. Had to do it carefully enough so this was just seamless. And then I had to add 3 chapters. I had to add about 100 pages, updating it from the years 2001 through 2013. And it had to not look like an add-on. It had to look like it belonged with the book. And so I had to absorb Don's style. I had to not just copy it, I had to really understand what made the book so good. So I read it and reread it and picked it apart and outlined it and everything. I'm sure I still have not measured up, but I think it's pretty close. And I think those of you who have read the earlier versions, I hope won't really recognize, it won't come out in neon lights where I've added things. But I had tried to update it in a way that makes it more relevant, both in terms of the information that we've now seen through the archives, primarily Eastern European archives that have opened up, and then events of the last 13 years, which are very important in terms of developments on the Korean Peninsula.
Let's break those maybe quickly into 2. We had Charles Armstrong here at the beginning of our season to talk about his work with decommissioned archival material for Tyranny of the Week. So I presume that you're alluding to North Korea information, perhaps to some Chinese information in terms of the historical part?
The Wilson Center, what used to be the Cold War project, now it's the North Korean Documentation Information Project, I think it is. Anyway, they have been through Romanian, Hungarian, some extent Russian archives, and have looked more at South Korean archives now, so that you get a picture of what at least those diplomats on the scene in North Korea heard, saw, thought they understood about the place, which fills in some of the gaps. It's very useful. And in some cases, on key issues, for example, the Panmunjom incident in 1976, where two American officers were beaten to death by the North Koreans. The common story on that is that this was a considered North Korean move emanating from the center. I actually was a new analyst at that time in the CIA, 1976. And our analysis, which is published, was that no, actually the North Koreans seemed to draw back immediately after this incident and try to create space for themselves for a solution, which was not analysis that was especially well accepted at the time. Well, the new archives show that the East German embassy in Pyongyang thought that it was a local incident, that it was not directed from the center, that it was something that came from a local commander. Turns out General Stilwell, the American commander at the time, thought the same thing. So I put that back in the book. And there are several other things where the common story, it seemed to me, didn't include all the options for the analysis.
And on the second, then, maybe the major crux in terms of the updating of the book, as you mentioned the last 13 years, how do you compact that into a readable form, and what are some of the big messages you try to convey to us on that?
Yeah, well, my job was, as I said, deleting, revising, and updating. And I want to say a couple of words on that. Not easy. Very difficult. To cram all this into 100 pages was not easy, because a lot has happened, but it really made me focus on what's important. In terms not just of U.S. policy, I wanted to work in a South Korean perspective, which was critical to understand how things looked in Seoul as the situation moved toward disaster. And Don and I agreed from the very beginning that one thing that was missing from his earlier editions, a critical gap, was the North Korean story, the perspective from Pyongyang. And so early on, we started to try to convince the North Koreans to cooperate in this venture. We tried it at a formal level, writing formal letters requesting their participation. That didn't work. So I ended up pestering the North Koreans every time I saw them, trying to convince them. I've worked with them for years and years and years. You know I'm going to do a fair job. We need to understand your take on events. It needs to be in the book if the book is to be accurate. Eventually, I got them to say, yes, when you come to Pyongyang, you can talk to so-and-so. And I said, that's great. But you know what? I just can't show up in Pyongyang. I need an invitation. Ah, yes. Never got an invitation. So I had to write this on the basis of my experience with the North Koreans. We met with them since about 1993 many, many times, hundreds of times. I've been to Pyongyang about 25, 30 times. So I have at least my own impressions of what their perspective is. I put that in, on top of which I trained as a analyst early on in North Korean media, analyzing North Korean media. And I learned from the very best of the analysts in the U.S. government. And so I applied that as best I could. I'm going to give a book, one of these books, to the North Koreans, and I'm waiting to hear what they say. And if they complain, the answer is going to be, sorry, you had your chance. If you don't like what I said, you should have told me ahead of time. This is the best we could do. Next time, play in the game. I'm hopeful that sooner or later they'll realize that they need to be more open about some of this stuff.
And in terms of updating the last 13 years by way of U.S. policy and where you feel the U.S. has gone or not gone, is that something you include, or you hold those opinions more to
There's
yourself?
a whole paragraph. There's a whole chapter. There's one entire. First, you got to understand, living through the first Bush administration, especially the first years, was horrifying to me. Having to live through it again, going through the documents and the memoirs and the interviews, was like watching a horror movie, because I knew how it was going to turn out. And as I would get to a point, I would yell, "Don't go there. Don't do that." And they did anyway. And it turned into a second disaster. Sometimes I say to people, on January 20th, 2001, when George Bush was inaugurated, our foreign policy toward North Korea fell off a cliff. And then I stopped myself, because that's the wrong verb. It's not that it fell off a cliff, it was pushed off a cliff. There was a deliberate effort on the part of senior members of the Bush administration, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and certainly John Bolton, to do away with the agreed framework, the agreement we had reached with the North Koreans in October 1994, and had in fact successfully frozen a good part of the North Korean fissile material production program, that is, their production of raw material for nuclear weapons. These people came in, they wanted to kill that agreement. They didn't hide it. It wasn't something they were doing in secret. They thought it was a bad agreement, and they wanted to get rid of it. Well, the problem is not that they wanted to get rid of the agreement. The problem is they had nothing to replace it with. They left this enormous void when they finally destroyed it. And, nature abhors a vacuum, and so do the North Koreans. And into this empty spot flowed further development of the North Korean nuclear weapons program, such that today the North Koreans have now tested the nuclear weapons 3 times and probably have a small arsenal, a small nuclear weapons arsenal. That began, as far as I'm concerned, on January 20th, 2001. And John Bolton says in his memoirs that a particular development by the North Koreans, that is the development of a centrifuge program, which is an alternate way to produce fuel for nuclear weapons, that the development of the centrifuge program and the discovery by U.S. intelligence was the anvil on which he could destroy the agreed framework. I could not ask for a better quote to illustrate what was wrong at that time.
I want to ask you a little bit, Bob, about the cover, and I realize that part of this may be a question better put to the publisher, but I have a feeling that you can at least help us understand it a bit better. One of the things about this cover, which appears to be the same cover as the first 2 editions, but it's not really, is the center strip. And the center strip in the first 2 editions had democracy activists in South Korea during the time of the protests in 87 and 88. And that was largely how we thought about Korean Peninsula in terms of a major concern, meaning thinking about Korea and the democratic movement and the normalization of Korea, the rise of Korea as a democratic nation. This is a very different cover in some ways because the center strip is of the North Korean military. And going to today's headlines with Song Tech and what may or may not be a power struggle in Pyongyang and the consolidation of power by Kim Jong-un, it seems that especially in 2013, given the missile tests, the nuclear tests, the bellicose rhetoric of April and March, and the tensions that have existed in the international arena, bringing us all the way up to present with the current tensions that we have in Northeast Asia between China and Japan. It seems that perhaps our fixation is more toward North Korean military now, or I guess the question then is, how do we look at this and how should we be thinking? If you were to advise a group reading this book, I really want you to think this when you think about the Korean Peninsula. I'm not saying that the cover piece is the dictate, but I think it's an interesting choice and not without consequence.
I deliberately wrote the last 3 chapters not to focus on the nuclear issue, as a matter of fact, even though that's something that I just talked a lot about. I didn't want those chapters to focus on that. I did want to, one of the chapters really focuses on the Nomu-hyun period, the South Korean president from 2000 and, help me with the dates, 3
to 7.
Because there's a lot of misunderstanding of his reign, his administration in the United States. There was at the time, and there's even more now. He's sort of dismissed as almost a clown, which is really unfair and inaccurate. There's also a tendency to look at him as somebody who just wanted to roll over for the North Koreans, wanted to make too many concessions. And people who looked at him closely thought, and these were both Americans and South Koreans, thought he really didn't care that much about North Korea. His focus was on making sure that the roots of democracy in South Korea went deeper, and that this still fragile turn towards democracy in South Korea got a foundation and a base and the ballast so that it could survive and thrive. That was the key thing he was interested in. And it's really important to understand that when you understand why the South Koreans had the policies they had toward North Korea during that period. That unlike the Bush administration, their focus was not on the nuclear issue, nor was it on simply making concessions to the North Koreans. It was the impact all of this had on the development of the political system in South Korea. It's an interesting, very important perspective, and it tends to be overlooked in the United States. Finally, the reason that we oughtn't focus just on the nuclear issue, it seems to me, is that even if you fixed the nuclear issue tomorrow, you've still got an enormous challenge on the Korean Peninsula of how do you get these two systems coexisting in a way that does not upset the apple cart in Northeast Asia. And we haven't even begun really to deal with that, nor have, I don't think the South Koreans have either. Finally, the thing to look at is that as successful as South Korea is, and there's no doubt, anytime people make comparisons to South Korea and North Korea, I want to laugh. There's no sense in doing that anymore. The South Koreans are so far ahead of North Korea in absolutely every way that they're meaningless comparisons. What you need to focus on is the fact that South Korea has run into that same welter of problems that every industrial society in the West has run into. Falling birth rates, holes in the social safety net, gross inequalities in income, inability to productively employ the educated, the new graduates from colleges and universities. It's not that South Korea stands out because it faces these problems, because a lot of other people do. It's that they've hit all at once. And the question is, are the South Koreans ready to deal with those problems? At the same time, they have this enormous challenge facing them with North Korea. And, it's an open question. It's to be answered. But it needs to be considered when we look at the peninsula, it seems to me. Don Oberdorfer's the last edition of the book, which was published in 2000, ended on a very optimistic note. And the reason for that, because things looked very optimistic. We had at that time a very productive policy with the North Koreans. The Secretary of State had just been in Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-il. The South-North relations were on a good footing and seemed about to make further improvements. So things look good. This edition cannot end on that note. It has to end on a very sober note. It doesn't mean things are going to go to hell. But if people don't start making the right decisions, the bad policies that they either continue or put into place at this point are going to have ripples through at least the first half of this century, I'm afraid. I'm not a cheerleader at this point on how well things are going in Korea.
Okay. Let me let my colleague Daniel just adjust your microphone. I wanted to ask you one last question, Bob, before we turn to the studio audience and get some of their thoughts and questions. And that is going back to some of what you offered us in your very first observations about Don Oberdorfer. And Don is a recipient of the Van Fleet Award here. We're very honored at the Korea Society to have extended that to him. He is a great friend of many here in this room, and I'm sure listening online, somebody who is widely admired in the community, and is somebody who's left really a lasting legacy. And we have a series here at the Korea Society called Legacies, for legacies to the Korea-U.S. relationship. And you, too, have cut your own legacy with a lifetime of very keen analysis. How would you like us to understand Don? You mentioned his first-person perceptions and analysis. We've had a media perceptions of Korea discussion here a month ago. But what do you see as his role as an individual, as a witness, as someone who documents, as somebody who conveys? And how should we think of that going forward in terms of the role of the media to inform us on Korean Peninsular affairs and make us better read?
Good question. Very good. I look at Don as a example of an age and a strength in American policy and in journalism, which unfortunately is past. It's a professional approach to his job, a completely nonpartisan approach to his reporting, a keen understanding that expertise takes time and effort. I think a lot of what we see now in terms of certainly reporting on North Korea, and there are exceptions, but a lot of it is a result of intellectual laziness. People who just don't take the time to do the homework, to understand more fully that the cliches don't cover the story. You won't see any cliches in Don's work. You will occasionally see the very careful dissection of people who he thinks made mistakes, but he does it in a way that is so skillful. He leaves room for the possibility that, well, maybe his view isn't right, but he really exposes, I think, the mistakes people made. And it's not a snap judgment. It's very carefully reasoned. The book is beautifully written because he understands that the story that he tells in this history is important for readers grasping what it is that they're looking at. That simply going through the dates and the personalities can't possibly explain the depth. And that's what he wants the readers to get, is the depth of this tragedy on the Korean Peninsula. He's been connected to this issue for a long time. He loves the place. He's got a lot of experience with the people, and we don't see that anymore. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's gone, and we can't live without it. I don't know how we're going to keep going forward.
We should also mention that Don kept his war diaries at hand as he wrote the original edition. And we here at the Korea Society have spent a good deal of the last 4 years recognizing their sacrifice and service, and this being the 60th anniversary of the end of the war. I thought that your mention of Don's having those was very poignant. And I would mention that we've just set up a display case outside the store, for those of you who are keen to see it, of winter items from Korean War veterans. So please do have a look on the way out. Now we will move to the signing, and we will go ahead and swivel the table here. You may purchase the book out front if you haven't already done so. And Bob has very kindly agreed to stay and sign. And I did want to thank Bob very much, if you would join me in that.